Hello, and we're here today with Rosemary Gard, author of the Destiny series of books about Croatians and Croatian immigrants to America. And we're going to talk today about the series of books and how they came to be. Hello, Rosemary. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Great. And we wanted to talk today just about the series of books. Now, the very first book, well, all the books have Destiny in the name. And tell us a little bit about why it has Destiny in the name, and how did these books come to be? Why did you start writing the first one?
Well, I feel I was destined to write these books. My brothers were 18 and 19 years older than I when I was born. Neither one of them could speak Croatian, but that was my first language. And then in 1956, my father sent me to Croatia to stay with my aunt and cousins for 3 months. And I learned so much when I was there. And the costume, the reason I call this book Destiny's Dowry is because they gave me an entire Croatian dowry. And this dress was part of the dowry. This is a wedding dress, by the way.
Now tell us a little bit about the plot of the book. Now the book begins with a baby who is born in a convent and then eventually placed with a family.
Yes, she thought she was an orphan, but she wasn't. As the story moves on into the second and third book, we find out who her father really is, and the reason he was wealthy. And of course he could not, the family would not let him marry a girl who worked in a bar in Zagreb. So she was on her own. And eventually she finds her grandmother in Venice. And in this book she falls in love with a gypsy, and the gypsies follow her to Venice. A gypsy woman follows her to Venice and is jealous. And her grandmother has her marry someone and escape to America.
Now, in the first two books, and the first several books, the main character is Katya, who is featured on the cover of the first two there. Now tell us a little bit about Katya, and where did the idea for Katya come from?
Actually, I think she's a lot of my mother. And Katya was very independent, and she was smart, and I didn't realize I was using my mother. But as I've gone through the books and I've spoken to people about it, I realized that a lot of Katya is my mother. Mm-hmm. Yeah, an independent, strong woman.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a lot of the stories, you have said in the past that it is your life experience where you've heard these stories. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing when you grew up in Gary, Indiana. And tell us a little bit about the Slavic community there and what growing up was like.
Well, it was a very tight community. Back in, I was born in 1938, so the women didn't have babysitters. And my parents were older already because their two sons were grown up and had left home. So I went with my parents everywhere. And it was like I was a fly on the wall. I understood everything that was said. They were polite. I mean, no one was rude or out of the, said anything they shouldn't have. But I heard so many stories, and I heard about their feelings and what they thought and how they felt coming to America. And also I was in a lot of taverns, which may surprise people, but my uncle owned a tavern, and which is why in my third book, Milan plays a strong role in owning a tavern. And my father sang with musicians in taverns, and I could sit in the back booth as long as I didn't wander around. But if I sat in the back booth with my mother, I could hear everything that was being said. And sometimes in some of the taverns, the owners lived in the back. And I could go and play with their children. So I learned a lot. I really did.
Now, in the third book, which you're holding, Destiny's Dance, now that's when the story moves to the United States. We should say the whole series begins in Europe in the late 1890s.
Katya is born in 1892 and comes to America in 1905.
And the reason for there are some smokestacks on the cover. This story then deals with how much of the immigrant population that came here found work in the Great Lakes at the steel mills in New York. Part of the book is in Lackawanna, New York, and eventually the book mostly takes place in Gary, Indiana, in the new steel mill that was just getting going there at the time. So tell us a little bit about life in Gary in that era, in the early 1900s, and what it was like to be an immigrant worker.
It was hard. It was very hard. There were no unions, of course, back then. And if someone was hurt, and many workers were burned, you just went home and healed yourself or died. There was no going to the hospital because no one could afford to go to a hospital. So they just carried you whatever rooming house you were living in, because most of the men just lived in a rooming house. And the woman who ran the rooming house washed their clothes and made food for them. And the bed that they slept in was used. The man that worked the night shift slept in the bed during the day, and the man that worked the day shift slept in the bed during the night. And everyone shared everything. They became a family because they left their families back home. So
now on the cover, tell us about the wicker suitcase on the cover. What's the story behind that?
I actually have this suitcase. My mother came to this country in 1905 with this wicker suitcase. We have it. It's getting a little battered now. It's showing its age. But this is the suitcase that my mother carried when she came to this country in 1905.
Well, from Gary then, tell us a little bit about the characters that are mentioned on the front cover there.
All right, this is Stevo, who goes through the entire book. I mean, from 1905 until 1917, which is another book I'm working on now. Stevo, and this is Tomo, who came as an indentured servant, escaped from the man, and became friends with Katya, who was like a stepmother to him. And this is Milan, who owned a tavern in Gary, Indiana. And I have to tell you that this picture is of my son. He came over one day wearing this cap on his head, and I told him, I said, my gosh, you look like the guys that used to ride the buses going to the mills. So that's why he's here. He's Milan.
So then in that book, the characters then, when we move on to the fourth book of the series, the story moves from Gary, Indiana, down to New Orleans, Louisiana. So tell us about that transition and why the characters went to New Orleans, and then also about the book also then starts to talk about the Dalmatian community in New Orleans.
Okay, Stevo was very unhappy. His wife, Katya, he ended up marrying Katya, became ill and died. And he was not happy. He was lonely. And he sold the store to young Tomo on a payment plan. And he didn't want to own the store anymore. He didn't want to be part of it. And in his dreams, his father came to him. Now, his father was a fisherman, and so was Tomo as a young boy with his dad in New Orleans on the docks. And his father had bought a house on Canal Street. And Stevo just had to go back. I mean, he was no longer happy. And he was very pleased that he went back. An entire new life opened up for him. And eventually Tomo sold the store and followed him down there. And these people are they're not related, but they're family.
And then the book continues on, and then the following book is also takes place in New Orleans. Now tell us a little bit about Destiny's Design.
Tomo had some money, and he bought what was at one time was a dress shop, and he converted it into Little Zagreb, which was a little restaurant tavern kind of thing, and anyone that wanted to could perform for tips. He didn't pay any salary, which was common back then. Musicians would just play for tips, and it was very successful. And across the street, Stevo owned a hotel, so they were still like a family together.
And then when we move on to the next book, which also it takes place partially in New Orleans, Danitsa's Destiny. Now, and the cover kind of tells us a little bit about the plot of the book. Tell us a little bit about Danitsa and why is she walking away with a suitcase and what happens to her?
Danitsa's mother was not a very kind woman, and she was very old-fashioned, and she resented that her daughter wanted to be so Americanized, and that she read so many books. Oh, she read books all the time. And they arranged for a marriage. Back then, marriages were arranged. And she was told by her future mother-in-law that forget about reading books. You're not going to have time to read books. You're going to be working in the kitchen. You're going to be working on the farm. And just forget about being an American girl. You're a Croatian farm girl. And one night, Danica, with her egg money that she kept, because no one knew that she kept some of the money that she sold from eggs except her father, and he saw her leave and he let her go. And she ended up in New Orleans, and she ended up working in the hotel, in the Dalmatia Hotel that Stevo owned. And eventually she fell in love with Tomo, but then there was another person. There was a singer there named John that was interested in her, and so the two men were kind of vying for her, but she ended up marrying John.
Okay, and then we move on to what is currently the final book in the series, Stefan's Destiny. And now tell us again a little bit about what happens with Stefan and the continuation of the story.
Well, Stefan actually is a cousin of Katya's. And because he comes from a very wealthy family and his father was not allowed to marry Katya's mother, so he comes to America to be with his cousin, because he wanted to see what America was like, and he abandoned his wife, who they owned a store together in Zagreb. And he comes looking for Katya. He comes to the store and finds out that Katya had died. And in the meanwhile, the wife that he left in Zagreb, because she had 2 miscarriages, he held that against her. That's why he left her there. She comes to America with her doctor, who loved her, but he didn't want her coming to America alone. And Stefan, in time, goes looking for his wife Barbara, because she's in New Orleans with Dr. Popovich. And it gets very confusing. But he comes looking for her, and he finds her, and it doesn't work out well.
Well, Rosemary, that's about all the time we have today. Thank you so much for sharing the plot lines of your books with us. For those of you out there, the books are available at rosemarygard.com, also at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, It's available in print version or e-format. So we thank you very much for watching today, and have a great Croatia Fest. Goodbye.